right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to September's Lunch and Learn presentation. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to get connected, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, thank you so much for being here this month for this installation of Lunch and Learn. We're going to give folks a few minutes to log on, and then we'll go ahead and get started in a couple of moments. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Thanks so much for your patience. We're going to get started here in about 30 seconds. Thank you for being here for September's Lunch and Learn presentation. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Emily, and I work on the Programs and Outreach team here at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of Lunch and Learn, Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte and the Material World of an Imperial Legacy. This program is presented in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland 4 Centuries Project. If you have any questions during the program, please enter them into the chat box below or the comments, and we'll address them at the end of the lecture. And now I'm going to turn it over to Elaine at the Maryland State Archives.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Elaine Rice-Bachman. I am Maryland State Archivist, and I want to acknowledge the Archives appreciation to Enoch Pratt Library for hosting the Lunch and Learn program and providing this platform that enables us to reach such a wide audience. It is my privilege to be speaking to you from my office here at the Archives, where I first came to work in 1994 as the curator of the state's art collection, which is managed by this agency. And that might seem unusual to those who think about only archives and manuscripts being in archives, but art and artifacts are records as well of the people who made them, the people who used or displayed them. They record the history of the society and its economy, and it tells you something about the value of an object, in fact, because it was preserved into the future. So as historians, as we are striving to recreate the lives of people who lived long before us, we must examine all the evidence that remains and not work in a vacuum of just one type of source. That really is the essence of material culture, this interdisciplinary approach. And it is in the study of material culture in the Winterthur program that I first met today's speaker, Alexandra Deutsch, as fellow students. And since then, we've had the pleasure of working together through collaborative projects at Maryland institutions and now again at Winterthur. Throughout her career, Alexandra has examined material culture to use art, objects, fashion, and archival documentation to interpret stories of people and places from the past, including many Marylanders, such as the captivating Betsy Patterson Bonaparte, who you'll hear about today. And I'll defer to my friend Bert Kummerow to tell you more about today's program and to introduce Alexandra. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Elaine. It's great having you here. It's a pleasure to have our partner, Elaine Bachman, the State Archivist, joining us for this month's lecture. And welcome everyone as well to our Lunch and Learn program. It is also a pleasure to thank our other partner, the Enoch Pratt Free Library, for its essential assistance in presenting these monthly excursions into Maryland's fascinating history. Now, I'm here today representing the Maryland's 4 Centuries Project, and we are preparing to spread our Maryland Mosaic program throughout the state in preparation for the 250th U.S. anniversary in 2026. We will soon be contacting institutions and groups in all 23 counties and Baltimore City in Maryland. Each will be notified that they have a historic first, not only here in Maryland, but also in the entire nation. They can use that first as mosaic partners to develop programming in the 2026 anniversary with statewide recognition and promotion from Maryland's 250th Commission. Now, the Maryland Mosaic is designed specifically to show the rest of the country that our state may be small, but we have a big, big history. Now, as Elaine pointed out, today's speaker, our good friend and colleague, deserves special recognition for her role in preserving and interpreting Maryland history. It is my pleasure to have Alexandra Deutsch as a former valued and talented colleague when I led the Maryland Historical Society, now the Maryland Center for History and Culture. We were lucky enough to participate using the Society's unmatched collections in two anniversaries, the War of 1812 Bicentennial and the Civil War Sesquicentennial. The real highlight for both of us, however, was mounting an exhibit interpreting the life of one of Maryland's most fascinating characters. To say that Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte's story is worthy of a soap opera follows short of the international drama of her long life. Imagine a beautiful Baltimore belle born to wealth, an ingenue scandalizing Washington society with her fashionable but revealing dresses in the new fashion. Imagine this young debutante attracting the fervent attentions of a foreign visitor, Jerôme Bonaparte, the youngest brother of the Emperor Napoleon. Now that should get your attention. And there is no one more qualified to tell you the rest of the story than Alexandra. It's a long story covering much of the 19th century, and it is filled with ambition, opportunity, and adventure, and ultimately with disappointment and despair. Alexandra has left Maryland, as Elaine pointed out, to lead the collections management and interpretation of the nationally recognized Winterthur House and Museum in Delaware. She is putting her many talents to work, mounting exhibits that are getting national attention. I know, however, that she will never leave Betsy Bonaparte's story totally behind. It's too interesting, even haunting, as well as more than a bit maddening. Now, please welcome my good friend and colleague, Alexandra Deutsch.
Thank you so much, Elaine and Bert, for those generous remarks. I also want to extend a special thank you to Madeline McCauley, Owen Laurie, and Emily Levine, who have worked with me in preparation for today. And it's such a privilege to be participating in this joint program because although I may be at Winterthur, a deep piece of my heart is with Maryland history. And I look forward to sharing this rather epic story with you at a brisk clip. So without further ado, let's turn to Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte. So I'm going to begin in an unconventional place. I'm going to begin at the end of Elizabeth Bonaparte's life. And if you think about images of Elizabeth, you do not think of the image I'm showing you from 1854, an aged Elizabeth, a silhouette cut while visiting the Astors at their summer home outside of New York City, where she, like many who visited the shore at that time, decided to have a silhouette cut. This is the only image to date I have ever found of Elizabeth allowing herself to be represented in her later years, because it is the Elizabeth we see here and the Elizabeth we later see in this daguerreotype, this triple portrait that we most associate with her. But it is important to recognize that she dies at 94 years old. She is born in 1785, dying in 1879, and she comes through the trajectory of American history in the years following the American Revolution and through almost to the end of that wonderful and rich period of the 19th century. But she herself wrote, "I do not intend to have the signs of decrepitude to descend to posterity." And so she was often requested from strangers and friends to have her image taken. And in an age of photography, it's amazing to me that no images to date have materialized of her that was done through photography. So if you wanted an image of Elizabeth, you could have a photograph or you could have a copy of her iconic triple portrait. Here we see by Gilbert Stuart, done in 1804. The only triple portrait in the history in this period of American portraiture, Gilbert Stuart being, it is said, so taken with her beauty that she could only be depicted in several views. But now we have to turn to the men, because it is the men in Elizabeth's life who set her on a trajectory that I am going to explore with you today, and actually set in motion a trajectory for the future generations of the American Bonapartes. Let's begin with Jerome Bonaparte, the youngest brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who comes into Elizabeth's life in 1802. He is the wayward and troublesome brother to Napoleon, who had been sent to sea to get him to fly right. So much for that. After an incident in the Caribbean where he fired on an English vessel between 1801 and 1802, this incident happened. Not a good time to be a French ship firing on a British ship. He hightailed it to America. And when he arrived, he connected with a great naval hero, Joshua Barney, who many of you may know from Maryland history. And Barney, who is said to be quite a ladies' man, mentioned to Jerome, who also had a taste for the ladies, that the most beautiful woman in America was in fact right in Baltimore. And we do not know how they met, but in fact, they met. Ultimately, it is Napoleon who Elizabeth will admire the most while disdaining her future husband, Jerome. And it is a man who she will revere because she views him as the one man in her life who followed through on a promise to her. The two men in her life, Jerome and her father, here we see William Patterson, are the men that she carries venom with for the rest of her life. Two men who did not fulfill their promises to her. And so it is ironic that Napoleon, the very person who will in 1805 annul her marriage to Prince Jerome, changing the course of her life, that she will so admire. Her father will disinherit her in 1835 in an astonishing will, one of the most remarkable autobiographical wills ever written, proclaiming that she had caused him more trouble than any of all his children put together. And although leaving her a minimal inheritance, in fact, did as close to disinheriting her as possible. And Prince Jerome, who ultimately marries another woman and more egregiously had abandoned her while pregnant with their child. Elizabeth was a nomadic soul, a restless soul, and one who Prince Jerome held huge promise to. Here we're looking at the first object I ever encountered at the Maryland Historical Society, now Maryland Center for History and Culture. It is a red trunk. These red trunks, probably exported from China, were for more elite people a readily available traveling trunk. And I was not yet working at the Maryland Historical Society at that time, but walked by this trunk on view in the late 90s. And I started looking at it and I realized that on one side, it says Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte, and then it has labels that say Elizabeth Bonaparte, Elizabeth Bonaparte née Patterson. And I remember at the time thinking, what is the story of this woman with essentially these two identities? And what on earth is a woman from Baltimore doing marrying a Bonaparte? That marriage did not end well, and this is the story so often told about Elizabeth. In 1805, after Pope Pius VII refuses to annul this Catholic marriage that had taken place in 1803, Napoleon, who at that point is emperor, decides that he himself can annul the marriage. Napoleon wrote to Pius, urging him to do the same, but he decides that he will take it on himself if he cannot. But he does record in May of that year, I quote, "I have spoken several times to your holiness about a young brother of 19 whom I had sent on a frigate to America," a bit of a gentle way of describing how he had made his way to America, "and who, after a stay of a month, was married in Baltimore, although a minor, to a Protestant, daughter of a merchant of the United States. He has just returned. He realizes his mistake. According to our laws, the marriage is invalid. I have sent Miss Patterson, his so-called wife, back to America." And so that is exactly what ultimately happens. The marriage is annulled officially by Napoleon in 1805. Elizabeth is forced to give birth to a son, Jerôme Napoléon Bonaparte, in London, England being the only country who would take a pregnant Elizabeth in for shelter so she could give birth to their son. And Jerome, just 1 year later, marries Catherine Sebastian Wingenat, who is known as Catherine of Württemberg, and ensconces himself in Hesse Castle. And here you see a portrait of him with Catherine, and also an enigmatic portrait that remains at Hesse Castle, commissioned by King, at that time, King Jerome, of his ex-wife, with his son, Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte, grasping her hand, and her hand resting on his bust. He chose to have this life-size portrait ensconced in his private chambers, where it remained for over a century. Elizabeth herself did not let go of her imperial legacy, particularly because she had given birth to a son who she had ensured that every protocol to acknowledge his official royal birth would be followed. And so the witnessing of his birth in England is conducted as if it is a royal birth, and all those documents survive at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. In 1817, she creates an unusual union of miniatures, an 1801 portrait of her ex-husband united with her own portrait in 1817. I think it is an unusual thing for a woman to unite their own portrait with their ex-husband, but this is the imperial legacy, because ultimately this miniature will go to her son and pass through the generations. We are blessed to have thousands of documents, because Elizabeth was not only a prolific writer, but an obsessive recorder of her own history. She passed that to her children, and here this wonderful French-made desk at the Maryland Historical Society, which we know to be hers, actually giving her name as Eliza Patterson, the legal name that she returns to after her divorce in 1815. But it is on this desk many of her words are written, and benefited tremendously this project, which, as Elaine alluded to, is a heavily based in archival sources project. It is gifts like this, like her red account book, one of perhaps a dozen books that she described as her red cahier, red notebooks, What is particularly astonishing about several of these notebooks, but the red account book that I'm showing you here, is that when I first opened it, it is just a mundane recording of expenses, some in Europe, some in America. For instance, 7 June, washing of 4 weeks. But flipped the other direction, this is what she may have referred to as the skeleton of her memoirs. She often referred to the skeleton of her memoirs in later years because, having spent time with women of letters, she intended to write her own autobiography, her own story. But unfortunately, to date, that has not been found. It is said it has existed, but at some point, perhaps it was simply too much for anyone to take. So we're blessed to have the skeleton of her memoirs, some of which I'm going to share with you. And here is a little quote to give you a taste of what Elizabeth may have written on that desk. I quote, "I judged old Jerôme Malaparte," one of her favorite nicknames for him, Mal being bad in exchange for what typically would be bon, B-O-N, good. "I judged old Jerôme Malaparte by former experience of his scoundrelism. I said that only evil could derive from him. Can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard his spots? This cowardly, brutal, remorseless, black heart who has destroyed the happiness of those worth 1,000 of such mean-souled wretches as himself." End quote. It's an eye-waterer, and this is how Elizabeth wrote. She also turned almost every source into an autobiography. In this case, a book written by Madame de Staël, not the de Staël you all think of, but an earlier Madame de Staël, which is a fascinating life story of Marjorie de Launay, Baron de Staël. The book tells of her being orphaned while still very young, imprisoned in the Bastille, and her difficulties in love. Yet despite she became a writer, something Elizabeth admired tremendously, she always had ambition and had in many ways self-made herself into both an authoress and an acclaimed woman of letters. Elizabeth annotates this very interesting underlined quote, which essentially says that ambition was the motor spring of her soul. And Elizabeth writes in the margins, "It ever was mine, EP." So her library is full of these dialogues with these publications. This, in fact, was a book she returned to many times. In her obsessive record keeping, her account books in many cases are actually account books, but this being one of the most extraordinary, where she has tipped in the details of a $65,714 settlement, which she begins negotiating with Napoleon, that is Emperor Napoleon, prior to his fall at Waterloo. Despite his fall at Waterloo in 1815, every payment is made. This $65,714, in fact, becomes the corpus of what, at her death in 1879, becomes $1 million plus fortune. And thus, in fact, it is not the money of her father, nor the money of her first husband, that leads to her being arguably one of America's first self-made millionaires. She enumerates every payment ever received and then the interest that is initially borne on them, along with her other investments, which you see here. Until the last 2 years of her life, every bit of interest is recorded in her own steady hand. And so much of what I came to learn about Elizabeth was also a gift from a woman that is most often associated with her friendship with Robert E. Lee, who also was a great friend of the Bonaparte family, Martha Custis Williams Carter. She was a resident of Tudor Place, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, and a fellow boarder at the boarding house where Elizabeth Bonaparte lived the last of her days. That was on Cathedral Street. And Martha writes, I quote, Madam B does not at all seem to object to my taking notes of what she says. And on one occasion, I asked if I might write down something. And she said, yes, certainly. And then dictated as I wrote, end quote. Elizabeth loved to speak of her past history, and here this genteel woman, as close to American royalty as one could get with her association with the Washingtons, was a ready and eager listener. Her small notebooks of many conversations she had with Elizabeth now survive at the Morgan Library and allowed me to corroborate many details that have never been corroborated, including the information about that portrait of Elizabeth with her son that resides at Hesse Castle. Elizabeth herself turned every possession into an autobiography and did it by taking extensive inventories of her possessions on a regular basis, not only before she left for Europe during her 8 trips to Europe between 1815 and the late 1860s, but then annotating these inventories at the time, when she arrived in a new place, before she departed for Europe, when she arrived back in America. And so we end up with quotes like this about this pin. Pin, in form of a lyre, had been a present from Prince Jerome from his brother, the first consul of France, Napoleon. And later we look at a 20th century inventory of the estate of her great-granddaughter who married a Danish count. And there is the lyre, annotated again, Jerôme Bonaparte. She always treasured the possessions given to her by Prince Jerome, which then descend in the family, like this pearl and amethyst and enameled diadem, which remains with her until her death and then passes to her grandson. He also had gifted her, I quote, an elegant black Brussels lace dress to wear over pink satin in 1805. Both the diadem and this rare lace gown and mantilla, at the height of French fashion at the time they're purchased for her, are what I call the forgiveness gifts, eventually received by Elizabeth in 1806 from Prince Jerome. At that point, he is probably already married to Catherine of Württemberg, and arriving probably to gain some forgiveness for her after he had left her in Lisbon in 1805. She also held on to things that quite possibly were gifts to her from Prince Jerome before he had even met her, such as this armoire, possibly that he had attained in the Caribbean, but possibly retailed then in New Orleans. This remained with her in the boarding house. She also had possessions she herself had bought, such as these French ceramics, a lapis box, which in that case, we're unsure if that was a purchase from her marriage or not. But she had very, very few possessions, a single tea service, a single rouge pot, 2 forks that she carries with her for most of her life. There is only one object in her inventory that remains that in fact bears not only her initials, but a crown, something we will see in later generations. The crown motif will be adopted. There's a detail of the crown on a perfume and smelling salts flask. She also was deeply sentimental about her family, and here the 2 silver pitchers were gifts from her mother, who dies in 1814, a death that was devastating to her. And she always noted that may silly or delirious descendants never have them separated or sold. This is something she carries through all her inventories. Very few of her possessions does she mark with her own name. In the case of the French tea service by Durand and Lebrun, purchased around 1830, she does engrave the underside, Elizabeth Patterson, and then her 2 infamous forks, purchased in Geneva in the 1820s, when she is there with her son, who is finishing his education. She chooses to be depicted in one of her portraits in the only thing I was able to find that she had inherited from her sister, who she adored, who had died the same year as her mother. So you're getting a portrait of a complex woman full of vitriol, also deeply sentimental, and particularly of associations with her possessions. And now let's turn to the son who she puts all her hopes in. Her son, Jerôme Napoléon Bonaparte, nicknamed Beau, who as a young boy writes to his mother in 1815. He is 10 years old. He's away at school. He has not seen his mother before she takes her first trip to Europe. And he writes to her, I quote, "Do not stay any longer than 1 year for my sake." Unfortunately, she does stay longer during that trip. Jerome has a childhood that is largely dotted by times of absence from his mother, and certainly the feeling of absence from his father. And I think in the image you see of the little boy grasping the unfinished bust of his father, that survives as a preliminary sketch at Hesse Castle, there's a great irony in this depiction of Beau, who had a childhood that was characterized by a tremendous presence of the Pattersons and a tremendous absence of his parents. And yet Elizabeth pins every hope on this boy who grows up to look very much like Napoleon himself. Here, a wonderful miniature painted of Beau when he was in Europe. And I think all hopes were that he would make a European alliance. This does not go as Elizabeth planned in any way. And yet she had maintained since his birth a list of the European princesses that she had hoped he would marry. Beau himself, as a young man, writes to his mother, I quote, "The name I inherit is immortal. I will neglect no means in my power in order not to make myself worthy of it," end quote. Meanwhile, Elizabeth writes back to him in one of her asides, I quote, "Do not speak through your nose, à la Americaine," end quote. She also makes for him a list of words that are distinctly American, which he should not use, such as coachman, housemaid, sitting room, and he should never say, "Shut the door," instead of "shut the door." Shut being, I guess, the way at the time it was often said. A death blow to Elizabeth comes in what she considers perhaps the beginning of the mésalliance in her family, but arguably she herself had made a poor marriage, a mésalliance. But Beau, who had spent time with the Bonapartes as a young man, quickly learns that the lifestyle he grew accustomed to with the wealthy William Patterson, one of indulgence, of horses, of luxurious possessions, was not to be had by the Bonapartes, despite the fact that they adored having him with them in Rome. In 1823, he goes to Harvard, where he studies the rise and fall of his own uncle, Napoleon. He grows increasingly distant from even memories of his father, then King Jerome, and he himself finds himself becoming a true American. Patterson, in writing to Elizabeth, writes something that I think is very perceptive about Beau. I quote, this is William Patterson, his grandfather. I quote, "I perceive he is tired of Europe after having seen and expressed his anxiety about returning to this country. This I do not wonder at, for no one of any independent spirit could think of living in Europe after having seen and experienced the happy state of this country compared with that of any other world," end quote. Elizabeth Patterson, who adored Europe, of course, being the antithesis of her father, Irish-born, and yet utterly disdainful of everything European. In 1829, Beau marries the heiress, Susan May Williams, of a distinguished family. Her father, Benjamin Williams, founder of the B&O Railroad, had inherited extraordinary wealth, and all of this pours to the orphan Susan May. In 1829, they in fact marry. Elizabeth writes, I quote, "The nephew of Napoleon has no equal in America. I have told you and my son so often of my intention that he should never marry an American. I might have made 20 marriages, but I never forgot that I had the honor of having made one that rendered it impossible for me to marry a low person," end quote. This she had written to William Patterson. Her relationship with Beau deteriorates considerably after this. And yet the Bonapartes are thrilled. Madame Mère, the former Emperor Napoleon's mother and father, send busts as wedding gifts to the young couple. These get ensconced in their home. Madame Mère here seen depicted in this bust, and the father of Napoleon and Jerome, Charles. And these busts were a point of pride in the Bonaparte homes. Beau and Susan established themselves right on Park Avenue in Mount Vernon in a grand house where he maintains a law office. And he, for the most part, is a gentleman, though, of leisure. It is he who begins emblazoning everything with the Bonaparte coat of arms for his liveried servants. He commissions silver buttons with the Bonaparte coat of arms. He has pins made that are crowns. And here we see him in a stance very reminiscent of the emperor himself. He commissions furniture with the Bonaparte coat of arms. Here we see the Bonaparte coat of arms in this elaborate finial. And then here a detail from a mirror, again, the crown surmounted by the Bonaparte coat of arms. He goes to the great silversmiths of Baltimore, Kirk and Sons. Samuel Kirk and subsequent Kirks commission, and he commissions from them an entire service of silver, again, surmounted by crowns and the Bonaparte coat of arms. And Beau loved and lived a leisured life of an American aristocrat. The only known crowns to be seen to date in American silver and the coat of arms. And yet, this obsession with collecting the remnants of an imperial past, here a stone that is taken from the tomb at St. Helena, said to be from Napoleon's tomb, and a stick from the site, which is preserved now at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Allegedly a piece of a shroud from the coffin of the emperor. Desk accessories depicting the emperor. Again, a difficult history, but yet materially represented through the generations. A box with the immortalized image of the emperor, and even a hair ornament with cameo centering on Napoleon himself. Elizabeth, by 1857, notes that, like an Indian rubber ball, the more I am knocked about, the higher I bound. And she reflects on a life that, despite this broken marriage, she attains tremendous success and, in fact, fortitude. The obsession with representing this history is coursing through the generations, and yet there's an irony here. And so Beau himself will go to Europe, see this bust of Napoleon in 1858, and then commission Islin, a great American sculptor, to carve a copy of this Courbet bust of Napoleon, and again add that to immortalizing this presence of Napoleon, the man who ended his parents' marriage, but yet having it in his home. Now, Susan May and Beau have children, and they have two sons. Their first son, Jerôme Napoléon Bonaparte, again, a lot of Jeromes to keep straight. He actually graduates from West Point after briefly attending Harvard. He joins the U.S. Mounted Artillery in Texas and serves on the border during the Mexican War. But in 1854, he resigns his commission in the U.S. Army to join the French army and the forces of his cousin, who has now risen to power, Napoleon III. He fights in Algeria, the Crimea, the Franco-Prussian War, all receiving medals for his bravery. Much to his grandmother's dismay, he too forms a mésalliance. He marries Caroline Leroy Appleton Edgar, another woman who Elizabeth deems beneath him. She is a divorcee with 2 children. She owns both a home in Massachusetts and a grand home in Newport. And she had previously been married to an extraordinarily wealthy man, and yet she is deemed beneath her. She also happens to be the granddaughter of Senator Daniel Webster. Together with her money, which Jerome himself, the quote is from him, I quote, "I would not marry a woman without money," he assures his grandmother, and end quote. He, in fact, does that. They move to Washington, D.C. and build Chateau Bonaparte, which you see here, no longer extant, but formerly on K Street. There he fills it with references to his Napoleonic history and connections, including a 3-story bronze staircase that is recorded in a travel journal as at every level having both crowns and the Bonaparte coat of arms emblazoned on it. They have 2 children. Another Jerome, son, is born, but the great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Bonaparte does not form a mésalliance. Unfortunately, it is a marriage that Elizabeth almost lives to see, but does not, because it takes place in 1896. Now, Louise Eugenie Moke-Wietfeld, which is her full married name, marries a Danish count. She herself had been brought up spending enormous amounts of time in France because her father had these deep connections with France. And in fact, it is in Paris that she is introduced to the Danish Count Moke-Wietfeld. The Moke-Wietfelds are among the most important and significant royally affiliated and oldest families in the history of Denmark. And so this alliance is everything that Elizabeth would have wanted. And it is the first time that now generations of European Bonapartes will be born. Here it is Louise who, though in fact does make a mésalliance in terms of her happiness in the marriage, finally has the grandeur, the established royal connections in Europe. And here you see the home that she ensconces herself in. This is Glorup outside of Copenhagen, a tremendously celebrated house in the history of Denmark. And what does she choose to do? If you look on either side of the staircase, she hangs the portrait of the Empress Eugenie and Napoleon III. And the one thing said about this house, and here are details of these wonderful portraits, the one thing that is said about this house over and over again is that one would think they were not in a grand Danish home, but in a French home. She, in fact, does something very interesting, and these continue to be passed through the family. On her silver, she actually brings together both the Moke-Wietfeld and the the Bonaparte coat of arms. And not only in her silver, but in all her linens, it will bear both coats of arms. When Chateau Bonaparte is disassembled, she brings from Chateau Bonaparte this whole group of furnishings, and every one of them is surmounted or ornamented with Napoleon Bonaparte. It then is put in an upper bedroom, which is to this day called the Bonaparte bedroom or the Napoleon room in Glorup, and it is maintained today by the descendants in exactly the same way as she had designed and intended it to be just a detail of this wonderful example of a clock surmounted by a bust of Napoleon. And then even by the bedside table, just another image of Napoleon. Now, the other grandson, born almost 20 years later, Charles Joseph Bonaparte, he is cut from a different cloth. And in the end, he makes a marriage that I think, honestly, Elizabeth is so beaten down by the other marriages that she can live with this one marriage. Charles Joseph Bonaparte, who charts a very different course for himself, a distinctly American course for himself, is actually the grandson who Elizabeth loves the most. And again, probably one of the few people who did not really disappoint her. He has quite a remarkable career. After graduating from Harvard, as a successful student, he becomes a lawyer, and he devotes himself to public service, particularly helping impoverished women, something I think Elizabeth would have found utterly perplexing. He also served in the cabinet of President Theodore Roosevelt and ultimately became Secretary of the Navy. While Attorney General, he created the Bureau of Investigation, today known as the FBI. And he makes a wonderful marriage to a woman who Elizabeth entirely accepts, who she writes about in flattering terms and who I'll return to in a few slides. But upon his death, he is honored in a very interesting way in the newspapers. And I'm going to just select one of the quotes. In 1921, when he passes away, it is remarked in one of the papers. I quote, "We give high thanks and praise for our dear Baltimore Bonaparte, who allowed no foreign lure or element to interfere with the preservation of his individuality, but will ever be known throughout the world as a Christian gentleman, an ardent patriot, an American citizen, pure and simple." This here is the favorite grandchild of the ultimate royalist, Elizabeth Bonaparte, the ultimate monarchist. He, though, continues the Kirk tradition. He builds on the silver service with the crown. And he creates the Blue Room, a room in his home that is entirely devoted to the Napoleonic artifacts. It is ultimately this room and the other possessions that he had inherited that are left to the then Maryland Historical Society. He himself preserved an imperial legacy while distancing himself from it as a patriot. When he and his wife would entertain, she would often be noted wearing the laces of Elizabeth Bonaparte. And here we see her later in life, Ellen Channing Day Bonaparte. It is possible she has included laces passed down from Elizabeth Bonaparte in this particular outfit. In 1921, when she dies, she wants him, her husband, to be immortalized as a great American, a great patriot, and she wants his memory to inspire others. This, in fact, moves her to give the entire contents plus of the Blue Room to the Maryland Historical Society. So to wrap up, we'll go to where is Elizabeth in all this? Elizabeth, at her end of her life, is living in Mrs. Gwynne's boarding house. And if you look in the foreground of that photograph, you will see a cluster of mansard roof row houses or buildings, just to sort of the lower left, middle, towards the middle. And right there, the fourth one in from the left is in fact Mrs. Gwynne's. And this is a genteel boarding house. She has multiple rooms on the lower floor, but she is living very, very minimally. And we know this because we have the diaries of Martha Ann Custis. She continues to be vitriolic about old Malaparte. She never stops saving every article she can find in the newspapers about them, annotating them with hideous remarks about him. So her hatred for him did not abate in any way. And yet, his portrait is one of the few things hanging on the walls in her boarding house when she dies in 1879. And to give context for how extraordinary that is, in 1879, when there is a probate inventory taken of her room at her bedroom at the boarding house, I'm going to read you how little is there in her room. By 1879, there is one large easy chair, one bookcase, one stand, one towel rack, one clock, 2 plaster busts, other busts, which one has to ask what they are of, one cushion, one commode, her small collection of silver. And we know that this portrait was also there. So here's a woman living with so very little, obviously some things not acknowledged by the probate inventory, but so very Spartan, and yet the presence of her ex-husband. And so we are left with a woman of contrast, a woman who charted an imperial legacy, who through the early 1860s continued to fight in the French courts with her son for his acknowledgement as a member of the civil family, and ultimately was unsuccessful and gave up. A woman who continued to be Madame Bonaparte in her celebrity, in her stature in American history. In 1872, she wrote to her grandson, Charles, I quote, "I never wished to be fixed like a plant on a particular spot, there to draw nutrition, propagate, and rot. I desired an elevated position in the world and wide celebrity. No efforts on my part, however disappointed, have ever been spared to accomplish my ambitious aspirations." End quote. For better or worse, my take on her, this self-made woman, driven by ambition, undaunted by the obligations of society imposed by women of her era, remained a uniquely American spirit. Restless, determined, driven, ambitious, individualistic, and forever committed to the most un-American of legacies for her progeny, an imperial one. I invite you to think of this portrait as a depiction of the complexities of Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte, a woman who in many ways embodies the American spirit despite her disdain for democracy. She herself wrote that she was a new kind of aristocrat who earned her position through merit and hard work, a notion that rests at the core of American self-determination. Her legacy, as you have seen today, continues to rest in 2 worlds of America and Europe, and like Stuart's portrait of her, continues to fascinate and perplex us today. Thank you very much.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, I thought you could hear me. Hello, can you use this better? Great. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, Alexandra. We do have some comments coming in saying this was great. What an amazing woman. Thank you for this lecture. So delightful. We do have some questions and we have a couple minutes to answer them. Is that okay?
Of course.
Lovely. Okay, so Elaine is asking, how did Elizabeth's peers in Baltimore treat Betsy after her divorce? Was she welcomed back into society?
It is mixed. I will tell you that she sparked a lot of controversy, and she really didn't care. I think she actually liked it. I think she's a great example of, as long as people are talking, they're talking, and that counts. She didn't hesitate to wear the latest French fashions, in part given to her by Prince Jerome, which were deemed very revealing. She also had a very striking appearance, a striking figure, and there are a lot of marginally obscene comments about how revealing her clothes are, made particularly by women, but by men as well. I think divorce at that time, although in this case her divorce is granted by the Maryland legislature, is still not a common thing. And there is a lot of negativity about foreigners and foreign alliances. And so I think it is a multi-layered experience for her. But to me, by 1815, as she sees the decline of Napoleon, What she cares about is the money she can make in America's growth and the life she can live in Europe. And I would argue that's an equal measure, but the life in Europe is what she cares the most about, her social peers there. So she cares less about what is being said about her by Americans.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Amy is asking, what interactions did Elizabeth have with Lafayette?
Interestingly, Lafayette does not occur in her correspondence, which is fascinating because when you look at her correspondence, it is a who's who of America, really through from her adult life to her death. She does not or does not survive, records the events of 1824 and his tour. I think in part she is abroad in much of that period, and she is remarkably disconnected in her surviving correspondence from American history. She doesn't write about it. She really doesn't talk about the Civil War. She doesn't memorialize or talk about the Patriots. It just, even a woman who spent so much time, particularly during the Jefferson White House in Washington, that is not what she writes in letters. It's not what she talks about with people. I think the one time that she does talk about America that stands out to me, and why I think it sort of goes to why does she not write about Lafayette, is she believed that democracy essentially created a lack of structure for people. And Lafayette was a great champion of democracy. You know, he's a great champion of the American Revolution and then the French Revolution and democratic processes. That wasn't appealing to her. She did not love that point of view. She actually believed that monarchy gave structure and place to society and was critical to happiness for people because everyone had a slot in society, which is also ironic. But no, I have yet, it doesn't mean it doesn't survive, but I myself have not run across her discussions of Lafayette.
And Caroline's asking if she had ever met or interacted with Thomas Paine, speaking of democracy.
Thomas Paine, again, another person who does not appear in her correspondence. But again, I don't want to say that nothing exists because things always can materialize. But again, a profound disconnect from American politics in the extant correspondence that I have read. Interestingly, Jefferson turns up regularly in the correspondence of Jerome because after she and Jerome marry, they remain in America. And he is frequently going to have dinner with Jefferson. Eventually, Elizabeth, before 1815, moves to Washington. She's very in the thick of the Madison White House. What survives is not the politics. What survives is the socializing. And that is really where you see any references.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time that we have today. So I'd like to thank you so much, Alexandra, for this essential work and sharing it with us this afternoon. I'd like to thank our partners at the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland 4 Centuries Project. And also thank you very much to the Hearing and Speech Agency, HASA, for providing interpretation and accessibility for today's program. And as always, thank you to our audience for joining this afternoon because we couldn't have these programs without you. So everybody stay safe, take care, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.